Chapter 23. Women. James was always amazed at the way an entire weekend whizzed by faster than a 50-minute history lesson on a Monday morning. He had his head resting on his desk and watched the seconds count down on the fossil watch Lauren had bought him for Christmas. The teacher was called Miss Choke, James's late mother's surname, and he wondered if she was some distant cousin of his as she babbled on about the 38th parallel, General Walker, and the Korean War. As James stared intently, looking forward to the momentous instant when his watch would display 11 minutes past 11 and 11 seconds, the mobile phone in his pocket played its little message received sound. He sneaked the phone out and opened the text. "Mr. Wilson," the teacher said sharply. It took half a second for James to register that this was his current surname and look up. "I know you're new at this school, James, but I shouldn't have to remind you that mobile telephones are to be switched off during all lessons." "Sorry, miss," James said, but he was more interested in the message he'd received from Kyle. "Am at front gates, meet now, mega urgent." Things had been awkward between James and Kyle since their row on Friday afternoon, so it had to be something to do with the mission. James said, standing up and grabbing his backpack. "Family crisis. Sorry, miss, but I've got to run." The teacher looked startled, and James's classmates were staring at him with looks that clearly said, "Pull the other one, it's got bells on." "Just because it's the last week of term does not give you the right to come and go as you please," Miss Choke said angrily, as James stuffed his history books into his pack. "Yeah," James gasped, as he headed for the classroom door and set off at a run down a short corridor. "Sorry." He bolted down 2 flights of stairs and out of the main school entrance, ignoring the woman at reception demanding to know exactly what he thought he was playing at. Kyle was across the road outside the school, dressed in jeans and polo shirt with a backpack slung over his shoulder. "What's going on?" James asked, looking around anxiously. "We'd better get moving. The school secretary was doing her nut, and they're bound to send someone out after me." Kyle pointed at an old Mondeo parked less than 20 metres away. "Don't worry, I've got a cab." "We've had the call." "What call?" "The feelers Viv put out," Kyle explained. "Apparently him and Tom met up with some dude on the university campus late last night. I got a call from Tom this morning and another from the activists about an hour later. They want to meet us, soon as pos." "Sweet," James said, as they headed towards the cab. "So are we back on speaking terms now, or what?" Kyle shrugged as he opened the front passenger door of the car. "You're not exactly my favourite person in the world. But Zara had words, and we have a job to do." As James climbed in the back of the cab, he could see the school's deputy head on the other side of the road, waiting for a break in the traffic. "Where to, boss?" the driver asked in an East European accent. "Take us into Bristol," Kyle said. "Some shopping centre called King Street Parade. Do you know where that is?" The driver got lost going through the tangle of one-way streets in the centre of Bristol, and the fare ended up being over 20 quid. "So what are we supposed to do now?" James asked, as they headed up an escalator towards a food court that had once been the top floor of a department store. "They told us to sit at a table and await instructions," Kyle explained. "We've got no idea how sophisticated these groups are, so we'd better assume that we're being listened to. Stay in character at all times." "Right," James said, almost tripping at the top of the escalator because he was concentrating on ripping off his school tie. The food court was a standard deal, with a dozen deserted kiosks and 20 people queuing up at the McDonald's. It wasn't quite lunchtime, so there was plenty of space to sit. "Shall we get something to eat?" James asked, as they sat down at a small table. Kyle's phone rang the split second his bum touched his plastic chair. Hello? A female voice came back at him. Kyle thought it sounded sinister, although that probably had more to do with the realization that he was being watched. I see you made it, she said. Took you long enough, didn't it? I told you I had to get James out of school, Kyle said, craning his neck around in an attempt to spot the woman on the other end of the phone. Don't bother looking, Kyle. You'll meet me soon enough. What equipment have you got on you? Kyle was baffled. Equipment? Telephones, wristwatches, pens, pencils, tape recorders, pocket knives, wallets. You must have some of that stuff on you. Sure, a couple of bits. Okay, I can see you've both got backpacks. I want both of you to take everything off, including your telephones, and place them inside the packs. Is that clear? Crystal, Kyle said. Once you've done that, wait at your table for 90 seconds, then head to the lift and take it down to parking basement 3. When you step out of the lift, you'll see our van. Climb in the back, hand us your packs without making eye contact, and then lie face down on the floor. The phone went dead in Kyle's ear. And? James asked. Kyle allowed himself to smile a little. Looks like we're in. 2 minutes later, a set of elevator doors broke apart and James and Kyle stepped out, surveying the lines of parked cars, looking for their ride. While the other passengers headed towards their vehicles, Kyle stood by the doors looking confused. Are you sure you got the right floor? James asked. She definitely said basement 3. Kyle was beginning to wonder if it was one of Viv's crazy jokes when a red Volkswagen transporter turned off the entrance ramp and started coming towards them. The woman in the driving seat had made herself unrecognizable with a baseball cap and dark glasses. She pulled up gently as the rear doors swung open. As instructed, James and Kyle clambered into the rear compartment and lay face down on the rigid metal floor. Packs, a woman shouted as someone else closed the rear doors, plunging everything into darkness. As the van pulled away, James tried glancing up. Face down, kid, the woman shouted, clanging her boot on the metal floor in front of his head to emphasize the point. As the van twisted its way around a series of ramps to leave the car park, one of the women in the back flipped on a roof-mounted interior light before both of them squatted down on cinema-style fold-out seats and began rummaging through the backpacks. Homework diary, the woman with James's backpack smiled. That takes me back a few years. Pens, books, mobile telephone. The woman opened James's phone and began looking through the stored numbers. As always, James had a special SIM card fitted just for the mission, so none of his friends or contacts on campus were listed. Once Kyle and James's phones had been checked out, the women switched them off to prevent their signals from being tracked. I suppose you're a bit young to be an undercover cop, the woman grinned as she zipped up James's backpack. Both of you sit up, face towards the rear doors, and take off everything except your underpants. Don't try looking at us unless you want my boot up your ass. Stripping down was an awkward experience because the van kept stopping and starting as it moved through some heavy traffic. The women checked the pockets and turned each item of clothing inside out before throwing it aside. The boys couldn't see out of the van, but by the time they were told to get dressed again, they'd clearly made it out of the city centre and were doing a good speed on a stretch of open road. A quarter of an hour later, the van pulled off the fast road and after some twists, turns and the squelch of mud under the tyres, came to a halt. One woman threw blindfolds at James and Kyle. Once they were tightly knotted, the boys were led across a muddy path and into a space that echoed to their footsteps. The blindfolds were ripped off, and it took James and Kyle's eyes half a minute to adjust to the brilliantly lit space. The building seemed modern, and was built from breeze blocks. It had a concrete floor, giant skylights cut into the roof, and James guessed that it had been built as a small factory. The three women were bigger than average, but hardly imposing. They wore trousers and boots, and all three had slipped into balaclavas before removing the boys' blindfolds. James was stunned to realize that the tall one standing in the center had a handgun pointing at his chest. "James, Kyle," she said, in an accent with a touch of American to it. "Thanks for coming. I'm sorry that we have to treat you this way, but the police and intelligence services are extremely keen to uncover groups like ours, so we take every possible precaution to protect our identities. For the purposes of this meeting, you can call me Joe, although that isn't my real name." James and Kyle each took a small bottle of mineral water from one of the other women. It had been stifling inside the van, and both lads unscrewed the caps and drank greedily, keeping one eye on the gun. "So you're the AFM?" James asked. "Some of us have undertaken actions in that name in the past." Joe nodded. "But we've moved on. We're setting up a new organization, the Animal Freedom Army. If you really believe in animal liberation, this is probably the best opportunity you'll ever have to make a difference." "Is it really necessary to point that gun at us?" Kyle asked edgily. "Maybe I've watched too many movies where people get shot accidentally, but you're freaking me out." "Please don't take offense. Your sister was overheard mentioning that you're both third Dan karate black belts," Joe explained. "Think of it as a compliment. I'm only holding this gun because you two could overpower us in a straight fight." "Can't you at least point it at the ground?" Kyle grinned. James thought he could see a hint of a smile through Joe's balaclava as she lowered the gun. "Your stepfather, Ryan Quinn, devised a wise strategy and always kept Zebra 84 as a small group. Recruiting members is the riskiest thing any anti-government organization has to do. The less recruiting you do, the longer you're likely to stay in operation. But of course, there is a downside to that way of working." James butted in. "You can't do much if you don't have any members." "Precisely," Joe nodded. "We're part of a new organization that aims to raise the bar for the animal liberation movement. We're putting together a spectacular, probably the most sophisticated liberationist raid ever. We'll need some fit young lads like you to pull it off, and if we succeed, you'll be helping to generate unprecedented global publicity for our cause." "So, what is this master plan?" James asked cheekily, fully aware that he wouldn't get an answer. "I'm afraid I can't reveal details until immediately before the operation, but I'll be frank with both of you. The operation we're planning is a huge gamble. I'm confident that my plan will work, but I'm not going to sugarcoat the risks. If either of you are caught, the chances are that you'll be charged under anti-terrorism laws and go to prison for many years. You're both extremely young. Are you really comfortable with that possibility?" Kyle shrugged uneasily. "No smoke without fire, I guess." "Are Tom and Viv going to be involved?" James asked. Joe nodded. "They've both agreed to work with us." "I'm in, if Tom and Viv are," Kyle said. Joe smiled. "It's good that you're both enthusiastic, but when you're planning a complex operation, every member of the team must show absolute commitment. The only way I can be confident that you won't back out under stress is if your abilities are put to the test." "Tested how?" James asked. "If you accept the invitation to join our group, we'll assign you an operation to carry out with Tom and Viv. The task we set will be risky, but straightforward. If you perform it successfully, you'll be considered a paid-up member of our group, and you might even get to see our faces." "Sounds fair," James said. So, do you tell us about our operation now, or what? Kyle asked. Jo shook her head. My colleagues will drive you back into town, and you can expect to hear from us at some time within the next couple of weeks. I want you both to think seriously about what we're asking you to do. If you have any doubts, just say the word and you can walk. But once you've made a commitment to our group, I expect it to be absolute. If one of you chickens out and ruins a major operation, we might have no option but to kill you in order to maintain security. Is that understood? James and Kyle both nodded. Shall we take him back to the van? One of the other women asked. Jo nodded, but suddenly changed her mind. She stepped forwards and pointed the gun at James's black school trainers. Are they leather? She asked accusingly. Yeah, my mum's always been veggie, but we only went vegan when we moved in with Ryan. Jo shook her head with contempt. If I see you walking around with bits of dead cow on your feet again, I'll shoot your bloody toes off.